suspect, like me, many of you have favourite songs from childhood. I was an enthusiastic singer as a child. And I remember going with my parents, and one of my favourites was "Tell Me the Stories of Jesus. I Long to Hear." You remember that one, some of you? Things I would ask him to tell me if he were here. Scenes by the wayside, tales of the sea, stories of Jesus, tell them to me. A lovely song. But they speak of a kind of idyllic life led by an idyllic person. And actually, it sort of twists our thinking a little bit if we come to read the stories with that mindset. So I wanted to get a few things clear before we actually start reading today's passage. And this is the first thing. Jesus was fully human. Yes, Steph, we know. No, we don't know. We think that he was fully human, but of course he always had God who would bail him out. And it wasn't as bad for him because he was Jesus. So being fully human for him was easier. It was not easier. In fact, arguably, it was harder. To be fully human and to be moving amongst us and to have to put up with some of the stuff Jesus put up with made it harder for him to be fully human. The second thing that needs correcting is our view that Jesus lived in some kind of magic storyland with a happy ending. Because we do know the ending, and we triumph, we glory in it. But therefore, as he walked around the earth, he was in this kind of magic storyland. And thinking of some of the stories, it was wonderful. People were healed, they were transformed, they were captivated by his presence. But actually, it means that sometimes we sanitize the story. It's taken from the depths of its real meaning into a simplified childhood kind of acceptance. So those are the two things I want to give a kind of caution about this morning as we come to read what is a very well-known passage. That we don't fall into the trap now as we read this passage of minimizing what happened because of its familiarity. Can I really encourage you now to engage, to really read this story as if this is the first time you have ever read this particular story? Because for me, as I've been studying it, I think it is the single most powerful story in the whole of the New Testament. And you'll think, then the crucifixion. Well, let's just wait and see where we go, shall we? So if you'd like to turn in your Bibles, we're going to be reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 to 46. And you are now suspending familiarity, and you're suspending the fact that you know ultimately there will be a resurrection. That is not the story at the moment in this passage. We don't know that. Okay? Here's the story. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." So then he returned to his disciples, and he found them sleeping. "Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. But when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more, utterly alone, and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So we're going to, I'm actually going to put my Bible down. It's a bit heavy, Simon. Don't let everything drop out of it. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to look at the obvious aspects of the story. We're going to be thinking about where it comes from, who's in it, what they're doing, and what Jesus had to face. Just take a moment so you know where we're going. So we start off then with the context of the story itself, what actually happened. And I just pause for a moment to say there are some places, I'm looking at Cam here as an English literature student, be thinking, Cam. There are some places in English literature where often I'd be reading to my students and suddenly I would find I couldn't go on. They thought it was hilarious. Moments like King Lear, when he comes on stage with his dead daughter in his arms and he says, break, prithee, heart, break. Or you think of Sidney Carton at the end of Tale of Two Cities. It is a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done. Yeah? Or you think of, topically, I hope you didn't go and see the new Wuthering Heights, and you think of Kathy, Nellie, I am Heathcliff. Actually, I found my students soon would be sniffing as well, which was quite encouraging. This is a moment to suspend the narrative. The narrative flow in these texts stops, and it does here. The story stops. What's just happened before? Well, we've come from the garden. We've come from the upper room. Tash took us there last week. And Jesus has been doing some stuff that we're very familiar with. Nice stuff, really. Washing feet, sharing a meal. It ends a little bit badly because the disciples decide to show off who's going to be the greatest. But we think, well, that's all very nice. We've sanitized the story, but he leaves there. But of course, what has happened is that Judas has gone. He's stepped out of the room and he is on his way. And now it's like the drumbeat begins because Judas has gone to get the people who will come and get Jesus. So all the time, Jesus is now going to this beautiful garden and he's going to pray. Boom, boom. The clock is ticking. So as we pause, we're thinking about the setting. Let's think about this setting just a moment. I'm sure everybody here knows that Gethsemane, the whole meaning of Gethsemane, is the oil press. And scholars have made something of this, that Jesus himself is about to be pressed, is about to be squeezed right to his core. We are about to witness a squeezing of Jesus' emotions. His ability to not just face, but to bear anguish. In fact, if you recall in Luke, Luke tells us that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So there's the conversation, there's the dialogue. Did you notice that Jesus tells the disciples, sit here while I go over there? Incidentally, he's already left most of them as he came in. They're all left behind. He just then goes on with these three. And then he says, you wait here and I'll go over here. So far, so good. Nothing unusual. They've been to this garden many times before. But something shifts. And the word that signals this shift is the word began. He began to feel. He began to feel. I don't know, I've been wondering about this. How many times in the Bible we are told he began to feel? Sometimes, but not like this. Not like this. Not like seeing the depths of what he's really experiencing. He began to feel. He began to feel the most terrible, terrible anguish. We're told, in fact, that he was sorrowful. He was troubled. He was overwhelmed with sorrow. He asks them, therefore, will they watch? And all the time, Judas is getting nearer. 1 hour. He prays. He asked for the cup to be removed. He goes back. The disciples have nodded off. He goes back again. Same thing. 3 times. And in the end, they spot Judas. So that's the kind of framing of what actually happens. So what of these disciples? Because obviously here, his closest 3 disciples have utterly and completely failed him badly. They've really, really let him down. Why did they fall asleep? Well, I think Jesus is quite charitable when he says they were a bit tired. But it's not an excuse, is it? It's pretty pathetic because Jesus has specifically asked them to watch with him. They, I suggest, have actually totally failed to grasp everything that has been happening in the last week. Whether it was the waving of the palm branches, whether it was the washing of the feet, whether it was the sharing of the Last Supper, they have not got a clue what is going on. And you know how Jesus has been pouring his whole soul into his teaching them. It's like he's desperate for them to know some stuff because he's going to die. It's all gone completely over their heads. They have not been paying attention. I mean, it could be, again, maybe they were thinking, well, it'll all be okay because it always has been. It always has been okay. You know, storms. Jesus came walking on the water. It sort of has been okay. Nothing to eat. And suddenly 5,000 people get fed. So, fair point. It has been okay. But they haven't understood. And it makes me think that actually there are 2 betrayals in this passage. We're used to the betrayal of Judas. And he's coming. But the other betrayers are Peter, James, and John. In his greatest moment, they betray him. Stay awake, he said. They can't. The second time, he actually says Peter's name. Peter, could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour? 1 hour. It's actually quite shocking, isn't it? Because he can't. And remember what I said at the beginning, that all the time Jesus is fully human. He needs them, actually. How bitterly disappointing. How lonely. How abandoned by his friends in whom he has invested his whole life for the past 3 years. Oh, and by the way, just remember that immediately prior to this passage, Peter has just said, "Oh, I'll never let you down. I'll follow you wherever you go." And the other two have been bickering about they're going to be the greatest. Well, here we are just a few minutes later. And they can't even stay awake. And it begs the question now for us as the reader of this story. Will Jesus abandon God's plan for humanity? Will he? He could. And he nearly does, actually. And then where would we be? Will he go through with it? For a group of men like this, who have just fallen asleep. Let's just move on a little bit, because there's something we've got to understand to really understand why Jesus suffered so badly at this moment. What is meant by the cup of suffering? What is this cup that he wants to? Thank you, Simon. What is this cup that he doesn't want to drink? May this cup be taken from me. Well, there's one thing it is not. It is not physical pain. It's not that he's afraid to die. Many men, martyrs of the faith, have died for their faith. And they've done it bravely. They've done it nobly. You think of the Oxford martyrs. You think of the memorial in Amersham. People who have had terrible, terrible death, the early Christians. And people have died bravely. And Jesus could have died bravely. He did actually die so bravely. Physically, he died so bravely, didn't he? So it's not that. It's not that at all. What is it that came upon him that meant that he was in this place of agony? What it is, and we've got to get this, is that the cup is the judicial wrath of God on all human evil. I mean, other writers, Greek writers, ancient writers, use this idea of the cup. Socrates actually drank of a cup of poison. He chose to die that way. This isn't what this is about at all. Here, the cup is the judicial wrath of God on all human evil. Stop a minute and think about the extent of all human evil. This means all the sins that everybody up to this moment and still to be born has ever and will ever commit. Everybody's. All of it. Every bit of it. So, bearing that in mind, think about what is the extent of God's wrath? What is the angriest you have ever been? That is nothing like the wrath of God. It is serious and it is almost indescribable, the wrath of God, righteous God, and all this sin and stuff that we have done. So what is the cup then? Well, the first thing is that as he leaves his disciples and he turns, and do you remember it said he began, for the first time ever, he sees God turn his face away from him. All his life has been lived with the Father. And now God turns his face away. People we love may sometimes turn their back on us and we feel mortified. This is the most, so way beyond that. God turning away from him. For Jesus, the ultimate punishment is to be cut off from his Father, from the presence of God. And as he walked, it hit him that is what had started to happen. When he turned to the Father, this means there was no one there. There was no one there. And this is a horror for Jesus, who has lived his whole life dependent on the Father. And he finds before him now not heaven, but hell. Second reason this is that even worse, as he starts to walk, he starts to experience, because hell starts to open up before him. There's a reference to this actually in Isaiah, where it says, "You who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath," there's our phrase. "You who have drained to its dregs the goblet that makes people stagger," and it made Jesus stagger. This is now beginning. It's not about to begin. This doesn't begin when he leaves the garden and goes with the soldiers. It doesn't begin when he gets down to the courtyard and he's mocked. It doesn't begin when he goes on the cross. It begins now, this minute, here. He staggers. And finally, and most dreadful of all, he sees, as it were, into the pit of hell. He looks in, think of the fiery furnace in Nebuchadnezzar. He sees down into a pit, and no wonder his soul was in agony, in great and earnest strife. Jonathan Edwards wrote in 1735, wonderful person to read, writer. He wrote a wonderful book actually called Christ's Agony, and this is what he said. He then had a near view of that furnace of wrath into which he was to be cast. He was brought to the mouth of the furnace that he might look into it and stand and view its raging flames, that he might know where he was going. So he's not worried about going to the cross, he's going to hell. And might voluntarily enter into it and bear it for sinners. This was the thing that filled him with sorrow and darkness, and which overwhelmed him. He sees into the flames to know and understand what he's going to do. He's showing us that he is human, isn't he? And there's not a magic fairy tale world where the Father will save him. He's got to do it alone. At this, the worst moment of his whole being, God turns his face away from him. So what will Jesus do? We are rescued because of what he does. And having seen and known what he's about to suffer, actually these words, "not my will but yours," are totally remarkable. They are inspiring, they are life-changing. He chooses at that moment to drink the cup. God is saying to Jesus, "Will you obey me, Jesus?" And he says, "I will, I will." In all the Old Testament stories, God says to his people, "Obey me and you will live." Here, He says to Jesus, obey me and you will die. He gets nothing out of it. He loves us just for us and is obedient to the Father. Under an ocean of God's wrath, his obedience is matchless. I had never seen it so clearly as I did in the last few days. The whole of God's salvation plan since the fall hangs on these words, these 7 words, all of it. It is actually the last rescue attempt God has. If Jesus doesn't do it, what else can God do? Nothing. Nothing. This is it. So many people failed. The prophets, all the laws, they've all failed. And Jesus is within a whisker of not doing it. Because he's fully human. You see? Paul actually in Hebrews explains it in this way. He says, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears and was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered and became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. And again, Jonathan Edwards comments, here on display is the wonderful strength of the love of Christ to sinners. So here, when Jesus at the end of the story says, rise, let us go, are the most heroic words. Rise, let us go, and so it begins. So as we end, what is the story about? Well, I'm sure we can absolutely understand, first and all, it is about God's love for us. God's love for us. Jesus' love for us. Jesus' love for us. We fall asleep on him all the time. And I'm not going to actually minimize now what we've just been considering by daring to compare ourselves to Jesus. But actually we do fall asleep on him all the time. We certainly don't get it. If the story of the Garden of Gethsemane does not destroy Jesus' love for us, nothing will. Nothing will. That was the worst test, and he loved us enough. And it's about, secondly, our love for God. What difference does Jesus' time in the garden mean for us? All the difference. It means all the difference. What do you and I look at in the dark when no one can see us? When we look within, what do we see? Sin, perhaps failure, the treacherous heart of Judas. But we love him. And sometimes we choose to say, not my will, but yours, don't we? In our better moments. How are you doing this morning on the obedience measure? On the disciple measure? And finally, what about prayer? What about prayer, church? The bitter time in the garden shows us how Jesus needs us to be praying. Not with a casual, cold, dull heart, do I have to for an hour, but with great earnestness, thy will be done. Like Don was praying at the beginning. God is our refuge. God be our refuge. I'm going to end by reading a poem. Hope you'll find this helpful. It is the most beautiful poem. It's 400 years old, so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge in the language, and it's called The Agony. A little bit of explanation from me. In the poem, the writer is George Herbert. Some of you may have heard of him. And George Herbert says in the first verse, people have tried to measure really big things. They've tried to measure mountains. They've tried to measure sea. They've tried to measure states. And it has been impossible. And he compares men, and clever men, trying to measure things with a spiritual understanding of the oh so much bigger thing that Jesus did. And he says that cannot be measured. It's even more impossible to measure it. So this is the poem. I need to perhaps, as a good English teacher, just explain that a brooch, it's very old-fashioned language. The word a brooch, when we get to it, means pierce. Okay? Here's the poem. Philosophers have measured mountains, fathomed the depths of the seas, of states and kings, walked with a staff to heaven and traced fountains. But there are two vast, spacious things, the which to measure it doth more behove, yet few that there are that sound them. Sin and love. Who would know sin? Let him repair unto Mount Olivet. There shall he see a man so wrung with pains that all his hair, his skin, his garments bloody be. Sin is that press and vice which forceth pain to hunt his cruel food through every vein. Who knows not love? Let him essay and taste that juice which on the cross a pike did set again a broach. Then let him say if ever he did taste the like. Love in that liquor sweet and most divine, which my God feels as blood, but I as wine. If we want to understand sin, come to the garden. But if we want to know the boundless love of Jesus, come to the garden. Hallelujah. Amen.